On a quiet evening in Oklahoma, the life of one young man was ripped apart forever. Glynn Simmons, a man with dreams, a family who loved him, and a life built on honesty, was suddenly accused of a crime he didn't commit. A violent act that shook his community, yet one he had no part in, now hung over him like a shadow he could not escape. But instead of justice, Glynn found himself trapped in a nightmare. The evidence was thin, the witnesses unreliable, and yet the system moved forward as if guilt had already been decided. A young man, a son, a friend, suddenly branded a criminal. And for years, that label would define him, while the truth remained hidden. For over a decade, Glynn sat behind bars, his life stolen, his family left to fight for him, and the real story buried, waiting to be uncovered. But what if the truth was never what it seemed? What if the real circumstances surrounding the crime were concealed, unknown even to those who prosecuted him, while Glynn lost everything he held dear? Before we dive into this chilling and unforgettable story, make sure to hit like and subscribe for more wrongful conviction true crime investigations. Because Glynn's fight for justice is just beginning, and every shocking revelation brings us closer to uncovering the truth hidden in plain sight. This is the Glynn Simmons story. Glynn Simmons grew up in a small town where life moved slowly, measured in school bells and neighborhood waves. He was the kind of young man everyone trusted, polite, dependable, and guided by a sense of fairness that seemed innate. His family, tight-knit and loving, had always been his anchor. Yet, as ordinary as his life seemed, fate had a different path in store, one that would test every fiber of his being. From an early age, Glynn had shown a quiet resilience. School was more than a routine. It was a place where he built friendships, learned responsibility, and earned a reputation for honesty. He spent weekends helping his father with small jobs around the house, and evenings often found him assisting friends or volunteering in the community. In every interaction, he displayed a calm confidence, a steadfastness that would later contrast sharply with the chaos of accusation. Those who knew him well remember Glynn as someone who valued integrity over recognition. He had dreams like any young man: to finish school, build a career, and create a life of purpose. Yet, he was unaware that these ordinary dreams would soon collide with extraordinary tragedy, triggered by events entirely beyond his control. Life in Oklahoma was quiet, sometimes predictably so, but in that predictability lay a sense of security. Glynn's family felt confident in his choices, neighbors respected his character, and friends relied on his judgment. To them, the idea that Glynn could ever be associated with violence was unimaginable. And yet, within weeks, that unimaginable reality would become his lived nightmare. This first chapter of Glynn's life, defined by trust, family, and the simplicity of youth, stands in stark contrast to what was about to unfold. It is a reminder that injustice does not discriminate by character, innocence, or intent. Sometimes, it strikes precisely those least prepared, casting ordinary lives into extraordinary trials. The night of October 19, 1978, was like any other for most of the town. But inside a small local store, ordinary routines shattered. A robbery turned violent, and the lives of those present would be forever altered. Carolyn Sue Rogers, a clerk, lost her life. Belinda Brown, a witness, survived but carried trauma that would ripple across the community for decades. The community was stunned. Neighbors whispered in disbelief. Parents held children closer. Friends and co-workers tried to make sense of the senseless. In a town where everyone knew one another, violence of this scale felt impossibly distant, until it landed at their doorstep. Investigators worked quickly, piecing together what little evidence remained. Witnesses recounted fragmented memories, fear threading every recollection. And yet, in the midst of confusion and tragedy, a focus began to form. Someone, somehow, had to be held responsible. Human memory, especially under trauma, is fragile. Details blurred. Faces were partially remembered. Voices sounded familiar, yet indistinct. But the surviving witness's account became the lens through which the investigation would proceed, a lens that, unknowingly, would distort the path to justice. For Glynn Simmons, this night would mark the start of a journey he could never have anticipated. He was not present at the crime, yet events would conspire to place him at its center. The machinery of accusation had begun to turn, and no one, not even the young man himself, could have predicted how swiftly and decisively it would consume his life. By the morning after the incident, the community's search for answers had intensified. Questions multiplied. Who was responsible? Could the perpetrator be caught quickly? And unknowingly, the answer they would soon settle on would not be the truth, but a convenient target, a target named Glynn Simmons. The night of the crime changed everything. It transformed ordinary lives into a narrative of fear, grief, and suspicion. It marked the beginning of a story in which innocence would be questioned, identity challenged, and the very notion of justice tested. In the aftermath of the robbery, investigators turned their attention to the community, questioning everyone who might have been near the scene. Names were whispered, alibis checked, and routine life became a minefield of suspicion. Glynn Simmons, a young man known for his honesty, found himself unexpectedly drawn into that net. It began innocuously enough. A neighbor mentioned seeing a young man nearby. A passerby recalled someone of a similar build. None of these details had been confirmed, yet in the urgency to solve the case, each fragment of recollection was magnified. Glynn, simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time, was now part of the investigation. The surviving witness, still haunted by what she had seen, was shown photographs. Pressure, both subtle and overt, influenced every decision. Human memory, already fragile under trauma, became a tool the system relied on to narrow suspicion. And then a photograph was pointed out, Glynn Simmons. For Glynn, the realization that his life could be upended came slowly. A name mentioned in passing, a face selected in a lineup. Suddenly, he was no longer merely a young man going about his day. He had become a person of interest, a focus of suspicion in a case he had nothing to do with. And once suspicion takes root, the path to accusation can be frighteningly swift. In that moment, the ordinary life he had known, the family, friends, work, dreams, teetered on the edge of a precipice. Glynn could not yet see the storm gathering, the forces that would soon engulf him. One knock, one name, one misidentification, and everything would change. And as Glynn opened that door, he was about to step into a world where innocence mattered less than assumption, where truth would struggle to be heard, and where a single mistake could shatter a life forever. One knock at the door would mark the moment his ordinary life ended and his journey into a nightmare of wrongful accusation began. Before the storm of accusation, Glynn Simmons lived a life that could have belonged to any young man in America. Work, friends, family, and small routines filled his days. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, earning the respect of those who knew him. To them, Glynn was reliable, trustworthy, and utterly ordinary. And in that ordinariness lay a fragile sense of safety, one that was about to vanish. Friends remember him as approachable and kind. He volunteered time when he could, helped those in need, and avoided trouble. There were no red flags, no signs that he might ever be accused of a violent crime. Yet, In a moment, all of that would be called into question. Life, as he knew it, would pivot toward chaos. Ordinary moments, small and unremarkable, are sometimes the calm before the storm. Glynn's routines, his interactions, his carefully constructed world were about to be scrutinized under a microscope. Every choice, every movement, every encounter would be analyzed, twisted, and framed as evidence in a case he had no part in. At this point, Glynn had no idea that his name had surfaced in an investigation, that detectives were quietly building a case against him, and that a surviving witness's recollection, imperfect, pressured, and traumatized, would become the central piece in a puzzle that was entirely false. The world he knew would soon be replaced by interrogation rooms, legal motions, and the relentless machinery of accusation. Family and friends would later recount the disbelief when they first learned that Glynn was under suspicion. To them, the very idea seemed impossible. Yet, in the eyes of the investigators, circumstantial details and an uncertain identification were enough to elevate Glynn from ordinary young man to accused criminal. The ordinary life of Glynn Simmons was hanging by a thread, and the first strands were about to be pulled. One phone call, one visit, one interaction with law enforcement would mark the beginning of a nightmare from which there would be no immediate escape. In just a few moments, Glynn would face the knock on his door that would shatter his world and begin the fight for his very freedom. It began with a knock on the door. Glynn opened it to find two police officers standing on his porch. Their expressions were professional but firm. What followed would mark the first step in a journey that would strip him of his freedom and test every ounce of his resilience. Glynn had no idea what he had done wrong, yet he was being accused. The officers spoke carefully framing their words, implying that his cooperation would be crucial. But beneath the surface, the weight of suspicion pressed down. A young man, innocent, suddenly found himself caught in the crosshairs of a criminal investigation. The interrogation room is designed to unbalance, to unsettle, to make the innocent doubt themselves. Glynn answered carefully, truthful yet cautious. Every hesitation, every pause, was noted and interpreted. Every explanation he offered was weighed against a narrative already formed, that he was guilty. In that room, innocence became a fragile shield against assumption. Questions were repeated, phrased differently. Small contradictions in his recounting of his evening, natural in any human memory, were magnified. The psychological pressure was relentless. Glynn knew he had done nothing wrong, yet the weight of authority and circumstance began to make even him question reality. The surviving witness's identification had already set the tone. Investigators and prosecutors were confident. They believed the narrative of guilt, and the interrogation became a tool to confirm what they already assumed. For Glynn, every question, every pause, every raised eyebrow felt like the tightening of a noose, even as he maintained his innocence. By the end of the night, the young man who had walked freely through his neighborhood only hours earlier had been transformed in the eyes of the law. A formal accusation loomed, and the machinery of justice was beginning to move. Each procedural step, each signed document, edged him closer to a courtroom where his innocence would be tested against assumption and fear. As Glynn was formally accused and his name entered the criminal record, the question remained: could truth survive in a system already convinced of his guilt? The morning after Glynn's interrogation, the investigation had already taken a decisive turn. The surviving witness's identification was treated as definitive, and the pieces of the case began to align, at least in the eyes of law enforcement. Glynn Simmons, a young man who had done nothing wrong, was formally accused of a crime he did not commit. The accusation itself seemed almost procedural, a simple step in the criminal process. Yet, For Glynn, it was anything but simple. A name entered into the system, a record created, and suddenly, his life was no longer his own. Each subsequent action would be filtered through the lens of guilt, even before a trial began. Witness testimony, though imperfect and pressured, became the foundation of the case. Investigators were confident, prosecutors poised, and the community, hungry for closure, focused on the young man now accused. In that environment, truth mattered less than perception. Glynn's defense was still weeks away, yet the machinery of accusation had already begun to shape the narrative. For someone who had lived an ordinary life, this sudden shift was jarring. Family members and friends struggled to reconcile the idea that Glynn, the kind, dependable young man, could be suspected of such violence. Yet, in a system that equated assumption with evidence, even innocence became negotiable. And so, the gears of justice began to turn. Glynn was no longer merely a suspect. He was the accused. His name, his reputation, and his very life were now under the scrutiny of courts, prosecutors, and the public. The ordinary rhythms of youth were replaced by legal deadlines, courtroom procedures, and a looming trial that would test every facet of his innocence. At that moment, Glynn stood at the threshold of a nightmare. He had done nothing wrong, yet the system was already building a case against him. The world he had known, filled with family, friends, and simple routines, was disappearing behind the walls of suspicion and accusation. As Glynn's name was officially entered into the criminal record, the question loomed: would the truth of his innocence survive the trial to come, or would the machinery of accusation consume him entirely? With Glynn Simmons officially accused, the wheels of the legal system began to turn. Pre-trial hearings were scheduled, attorneys consulted, and evidence reviewed. To outsiders, it appeared procedural, a routine step in the administration of justice. Yet for Glynn, every meeting, every document, every whispered conversation carried the weight of his freedom. Pre-trial proceedings are often overlooked by the public, yet they are critical in shaping the trajectory of a trial. They determine what evidence will be admissible, what witnesses can testify, and which legal strategies will be allowed. For Glynn, who had done nothing wrong, these proceedings were the first real test of whether justice would recognize innocence or yield to assumption. The system, by its very design, favors structure over substance and momentum over uncertainty. In Glynn's case, that meant the prosecution could rely heavily on circumstantial evidence and the identification of a traumatized witness. The defense, though diligent, faced an uphill battle against both perception and procedure. Every motion filed, every objection raised, became a small battle in a war that had already begun in the minds of those observing the case. The stakes were enormous. Glynn's future, his reputation, and his very freedom depended on how these early procedural decisions unfolded. Despite their best efforts, the defense faced challenges that extended beyond the courtroom. Public opinion, fueled by the tragedy and the urgency to find a culprit, was already leaning toward guilt. Every day in pretrial proceedings was a reminder that the system could move faster than truth, and that assumption often overshadows fact. See how the coming days would test not only his innocence, but the very idea of fairness. The stage was being set, the narrative was forming, and one question loomed over all: could truth survive in a courtroom ready to assume his guilt? The trial was about to begin, and Glynn Simmons would soon discover whether innocence alone could withstand the weight of accusation. The trial began with a sense of gravity few in the courtroom could ignore. Glynn Simmons, seated at the defense table, faced the prosecution with a mixture of apprehension and quiet resolve. Every detail of his life, every testimony, Every gesture would now be dissected under the scrutinizing eyes of the law and the public. The prosecution relied heavily on the identification of the surviving witness. Her memory, though fractured by fear and trauma, became the keystone of the case. Each recollection, each hesitant affirmation, was framed to reinforce the narrative of guilt. Circumstantial evidence, such as Glyn's proximity to the scene and minor inconsistencies in his statements, was magnified, shaping the perception of the jury. In the courtroom, perception often outweighs proof. Glyn's calm demeanor, which in another context might have demonstrated honesty, was interpreted as evasiveness. Every hesitation or pause became fodder for doubt. In a system predisposed to find closure quickly, the narrative of guilt gained momentum, while innocence struggled to speak for itself. Character witnesses spoke on Glyn's behalf, describing his integrity, reliability, and kindness. Yet their words, though sincere, were often overshadowed by the drama of the crime and the urgency of prosecution. The courtroom, with its structured authority and ritualized procedure, began to favor the story that was easier to believe over the truth that was harder to see. As the days of testimony stretched on, each moment added layers to a narrative that increasingly positioned Glynn as guilty. The defense fought valiantly, highlighting discrepancies, questioning motives, and reminding the jury of the lack of physical evidence. Yet the prosecution's story, confident and cohesive, held sway in the minds of those tasked with rendering judgment. By the end of the testimony, it was clear that the trial had become a battle not just of facts, but of perception. Glyn's innocence was a quiet undercurrent against a river of accusation, and the outcome rested on whether the jury could see beyond what they had been presented. The fate of Glynn Simmons now rested in the hands of 12 strangers, and when the verdict came, it would determine not just his freedom, but the course of his life forever. After days of testimony, witness accounts, and legal arguments, the trial of Glynn Simmons reached its climax. Closing arguments were delivered with the gravity of finality. The prosecution painted a picture of guilt, confident in their narrative and relying on the jury's perception. The defense, though passionate and methodical, struggled to break through the shadow cast by fear and assumption. In the courtroom, every detail had been scrutinized, yet truth often remained obscured by procedure. Character witnesses had pleaded for reason, evidence had been analyzed, and yet, the weight of suggestion, a witness convinced, a community shaken, carried a power the law itself could not entirely contain. Hours passed as the 12 jurors wrestled with the testimony, the evidence, and their own perceptions. Outside, family and friends waited, the quiet heavy with uncertainty. Inside, the machinery of the courtroom had done its work. It had framed Glynn not as a young man with a life ahead, but as a defendant to be judged, his innocence overshadowed by circumstance. When the foreperson finally stood, the weight of the moment pressed on every soul in the room. Words that would forever alter a life hung in the balance. And then, the verdict was read. Glynn Simmons was found guilty. The words fell like a hammer, echoing through the courtroom. Gasps from family members, whispers from onlookers, and a stunned silence from Glynn himself. The young man who had lived an ordinary life, who had done nothing wrong, was now condemned. His freedom stripped away, his future uncertain, and his innocence dismissed. In that moment, the injustice became tangible. A life full of potential, of dreams, of ordinary days, had been replaced by a sentence of confinement. The system, confident in its conviction, had overlooked the fragility of memory, the pressure on witnesses, and the absence of concrete evidence. Glyn's nightmare had begun, and as Glynn Simmons stepped into the prison system, One question haunted every corner of his mind. Would the truth ever be enough to set him free? For Glynn Simmons, the transition from freedom to incarceration was immediate and jarring. The world he had known, family, friends, routines, and simple pleasures, was replaced by the rigid, unforgiving rhythms of prison life. Every sound, every shadow, every glance carried weight. The young man who had lived an ordinary life now faced a reality defined by confinement, scrutiny, and the constant presence of authority. The first days behind bars are often the hardest. There is a quiet terror in the unknown. Who to trust, what rules are unspoken, and which gestures might carry consequences beyond comprehension. For Glynn, each corridor was a maze, each face a potential threat or ally, and every decision a test of his ability to survive. In prison, time stretches differently. Minutes feel like hours, hours like days. Routine becomes both a refuge and a reminder of what has been taken. Glynn quickly learned the importance of observation, noting the hierarchy among inmates, the subtle signals of authority, and the way guards navigated the line between order and intimidation. Yet even in this world of bars and shadows, Glynn held on to fragments of himself, his sense of morality, his intelligence, and his quiet resilience. These were the tools he would rely on to endure, to navigate the dangers around him, and to maintain hope that one day his name would be cleared. The first days were a series of lessons about fear, about trust, and about the fragility of a life once ordinary. Glynn realized that in this world, mistakes are magnified, innocence is often irrelevant, and every encounter carries the weight of consequence. And as night fell, Glynn knew that the true test had only just begun, a test not of guilt or innocence, but of endurance, resilience, and the will to. Life inside the walls of incarceration is defined by routines and unspoken rules. For Glynn Simmons, understanding these rules quickly became a matter of survival. Every glance, every word, every gesture carried weight. In this world, perception could be as dangerous as any weapon, and trust was a rare commodity. The prison was a microcosm of society, but magnified. Status, influence, and fear dictated behavior. Glynn, young and inexperienced in this environment, had to learn quickly. He studied the interactions around him, noting alliances and rivalries, and discovering that small acts of respect could mean the difference between safety and danger. The first encounters were lessons in humility and observation. Glynn learned to navigate conversations carefully, to understand when to speak and when to remain silent. Every interaction was a subtle negotiation of power and safety. In this world, innocence offered no protection. He began to notice patterns, how guards enforced rules selectively, how alliances among inmates shifted with minor provocations, and how fear could be wielded as a tool. Each day presented new challenges, and each challenge demanded patience, resilience, and an unwavering sense of self. In this world, Glynn discovered that survival was as much a mental game as it was physical. Awareness, discretion, and adaptability became his most valuable tools. And while his innocence remained intact, it mattered little here. Only his ability to navigate the shadows and maintain his integrity would determine whether he endured. As the day ended, Glynn realized that prison life was an unrelenting test. Each moment a challenge, each person a potential threat, and each choice a gamble. He understood that the real trial was not in the courtroom, but within these walls. And as night descended, Glynn sensed that a storm was brewing. A confrontation that could define his life behind bars and challenge his ability to endure the cruelty of a world that had already deemed him guilty. The first days of Glynn Simmons' incarceration were lessons in observation, patience, and survival. But as the nights stretched on, the quiet tension of prison life escalated into confrontation. It was here, in the dim corridors and echoing cell blocks, that the realities of incarceration began to press in with an unrelenting weight. In prison, conflicts are rarely announced. They simmer beneath the surface, erupting over the smallest perceived slights. Glynn, inexperienced yet cautious, sensed the undercurrent of hostility. He understood that a single misstep could lead to violence, that strength was measured not only in physicality, but in composure and strategic awareness. The confrontation escalated subtly, a word here, a glance there, until it became clear that Glynn's ability to remain calm would be tested. Every action, every decision carried consequences. It was no longer just about enduring confinement. It was about navigating a world where fear and dominance dictated survival. Through restraint, observation, and quiet confidence, Glynn managed to diffuse the immediate threat. But the encounter left its mark, a reminder that prison was not a neutral space, that each day brought new challenges, and that the human spirit could be tested in ways the courtroom had never prepared him for. Psychologically, Glynn began to understand the long road ahead. Survival required more than patience. It demanded resilience, adaptability, and the quiet fortitude to hold onto one's sense of self. Even in a system that had condemned him, even in a world that seemed indifferent to truth, he had to find strength within. The night stretched on, heavy with unspoken threats and unanswered questions. Glynn knew that every day behind these walls would be a battle, not just to survive, but to retain his dignity and his hope for justice. As Glynn settled into his bunk, he could not yet know what the coming days would bring, a challenge that would push him to the edge, forcing him to confront not only the dangers around him, but the limits of his own endurance. Behind the walls, Glynn Simmons began to understand that survival alone would not restore his life. Time passed slowly, but hope, fragile and flickering, persisted. In the midst of confinement, he began to search for ways to fight back, to reclaim the future stolen from him. Knowledge became his weapon, and information his shield. He studied the law, the criminal code, and procedural rules. He learned how evidence could be challenged, how witness statements could be examined, and how legal loopholes might offer a path toward justice. For Glynn, every detail mattered. The law was no longer abstract. It was a lifeline. The fight for freedom often begins in small, unremarkable moments. For Glynn, it was a quiet determination, a refusal to be defined by a conviction that had ignored the truth. Every note taken, every argument researched, every question asked became a small act of resistance against the injustice that surrounded him. He also began to write letters, reaching out to family, friends, and organizations that might help advocate on his behalf. The outside world became a critical partner in his fight, proof that even in isolation, the pursuit of justice could continue. The prison walls may have confined his body, but they could not confine his mind. Each day of preparation, each moment of reflection, strengthened his resolve. Glynn understood that the road to freedom would be long, fraught with obstacles, but the first steps had already been taken. As he planned his next move, Glynn had no way of knowing that the path ahead would test not only his resolve, but the very limits of justice itself. For Glynn Simmons, the path to freedom required more than patience. It demanded allies, strategy, and relentless persistence. Behind bars, he began reaching out to lawyers, innocence projects, and anyone who could help unravel the injustice that had stripped him of his life. Every letter sent was a lifeline, a call for intervention, a spark of hope. The support of family was crucial. They became his voice in the outside world, delivering letters, contacting advocacy groups, and raising awareness. Through them, Glynn began to see that he was not entirely alone, that the fight for truth could extend beyond the prison walls. As attention to his case grew, Glynn understood that time was both his enemy and his ally. The longer he waited, the more challenging the fight could become, but the careful collection of information, witness statements, and legal documents also meant that hope was tangible. Each fact uncovered, each discrepancy highlighted, was a small victory in the face of a system that had rushed to judgment. Even small victories mattered. A lawyer agreeing to review a file, a minor error discovered in procedural paperwork, a sympathetic staff member providing information, each became a stepping stone. Glynn learned that in the fight against wrongful conviction, patience and meticulous attention to detail were weapons more powerful than anger or despair. The deeper Glynn dug, the clearer it became. His case was fraught with errors, assumptions, and a rush to judgment. But identifying these flaws was only the first step. He had to find those who could act, those who could challenge the conviction, and those who could shine light on what the system had ignored. In a world designed to confine him, Glynn had found a way to reach beyond the walls. But every step forward carried risk. Every attempt to uncover the truth could be met with resistance, and every action required careful calculation. And as Glynn prepared to submit critical evidence, he could not yet know that those who had condemned him would resist every effort, and that the coming battles would test the limits of courage, resilience, and justice itself. Months behind bars had strengthened Glynn Simmons' resolve. With every passing day, he became more adept at navigating the legal system, uncovering discrepancies, and documenting injustices. Slowly, a picture emerged, one that exposed not only errors in his case, but a system quick to assume guilt and slow to seek truth. Every detail mattered. A forgotten alibi, a timeline misrecorded, a witness pressured to recall events. These fragments, when carefully assembled, began to paint a different story. Glynn's innocence was no longer a claim, but a pattern emerging from facts ignored by those who had condemned him. Yet progress was never easy. For every breakthrough, there was resistance. Prosecutors defended the original conviction with fierce determination, and bureaucratic hurdles delayed every motion. The weight of a legal system resistant to admit error threatened to overwhelm even the strongest resolve. Despite these obstacles, Glynn refused to yield. He meticulously prepared motions, coordinated with advocates, and ensured every discrepancy was documented and submitted. Persistence became his weapon and patience his ally. The fight for justice often comes in increments. A single piece of evidence overlooked, a minor procedural misstep, a sympathetic attorney. Any of these could become the turning point. Glynn understood that the smallest victory could ignite hope, and that every step forward brought him closer to the possibility of freedom. The walls of the prison could contain his body, but not his will. Glynn had begun to turn the tide, quietly challenging the assumptions that had robbed him of his life. Each day of preparation, each careful review of evidence, brought him closer to a moment when the truth might finally be recognized. And as Glynn prepared for the next legal hearing, the question remained: would the truth finally prevail, or would the forces that had condemned him fight to keep him behind bars forever? After years behind bars, the moment Glynn had long awaited had arrived. A pivotal legal hearing, one that could finally challenge the conviction that had stripped him of his freedom, was underway. For the first time, hope felt tangible, though the path ahead remained fraught with uncertainty. This hearing was not just a formality. It was the opportunity to introduce new evidence, highlight procedural errors, and question the reliability of witnesses whose statements had been the foundation of the original conviction. Every word spoken, every motion filed, could tip the scales between continued incarceration and a chance at justice. For Glynn, the hearing was a delicate balance between hope and fear. Years of preparation, research, and careful documentation had led to this point. But the legal system, while capable of correcting mistakes, could also resist them with bureaucratic rigor. Glynn's fate depended on convincing not only the law but the people entrusted to uphold it. Each revelation challenged the narrative that had condemned him. The courtroom, once a symbol of finality, now became a battleground for truth. Glynn's innocence, once dismissed, was now being meticulously argued, piece by piece. It was a moment suspended between past and future. The conviction that had defined the last years of Glynn's life faced scrutiny, and for the first time, there was the possibility that truth might pierce the veil of assumption. But the outcome was far from certain. The legal machinery could be slow, resistant, and unyielding. As arguments concluded and the hearing moved toward deliberation, Glynn felt the weight of years pressing upon him. The decision could change everything, yet the uncertainty remained, a tension that gripped the hearts of all who believed in his innocence. And as the judge took a long, deliberate pause, Glynn Simmons held his breath, knowing that the words about to be spoken could either unlock his freedom or extend the nightmare of wrongful imprisonment. After years behind bars, Glynn Simmons finally faced a moment he had long awaited, a pivotal legal hearing that could begin to challenge the conviction that had stolen his life. The anticipation was immense, not just for him, but for his family and the small circle of allies who had refused to give up on his innocence. The weight of those years pressed on him, yet beneath it all, hope flickered, fragile, yet unyielding. The hearing was more than procedural. It was a chance to confront the errors, the oversights, and the assumptions that had condemned him. Witness statements could be questioned, evidence could be examined anew, and every misstep of the original trial could be brought into the light. Glynn had spent months preparing for this moment in every way possible, studying the law, documenting discrepancies, and coordinating with attorneys and advocates who believed in his case. As arguments unfolded, the tension was palpable. Glynn followed every word, aware that the smallest detail could tip the balance in his favor or undo everything he had worked for. The prosecution remained steadfast, confident in the original conviction, framing the narrative of guilt that had dominated the courtroom years before. But the defense carefully dissected the inconsistencies, highlighting overlooked evidence and contradictions in witness testimony that had never been properly addressed. Each revelation, each carefully argued point, chipped away at the walls of assumption surrounding Glynn's conviction. For the first time in years, the possibility of justice, not just hope, seemed tangible. He understood that the hearing was not a guarantee of freedom, but it was a necessary step toward reclaiming his life. The hours dragged on, every statement weighed, every objection noted. Glynn felt the years of isolation and injustice compress into that courtroom, every moment a test of patience and endurance. He had learned to endure the prison system, but now he was learning to endure the pressure of hope, a hope that, if crushed, could have been as devastating as the injustice itself. As the hearing drew to a close, the judge's deliberation became the focal point. Glynn held his breath, acutely aware that a single word could redefine his future. The courtroom seemed suspended in a delicate balance between the past he had endured and the possibility of a life restored. And as the judge prepared to announce the outcome of the hearing, Glynn's mind raced with the knowledge that the verdict could either finally open the door to freedom or extend the nightmare of wrongful imprisonment indefinitely. The courtroom was silent, the tension so thick it felt almost tangible. Glynn Simmons sat upright, every nerve on edge, every heartbeat echoing in his chest. After years of fighting to prove his innocence, the moment of reckoning had arrived. The judge, a figure of measured authority, reviewed the notes, the evidence, and the motions submitted by Glynn's legal team. Every word spoken, every argument presented, culminated in this instant. When the judge finally spoke, Glynn's ears seemed to strain to catch each syllable. The ruling was deliberate, careful, and deliberate, each phrase chosen to carry weight. There was acknowledgement of procedural errors, recognition of inconsistencies in witness statements, and consideration of overlooked evidence that could have altered the outcome of the original trial. For the first time, the court admitted that the conviction might have been based on incomplete or flawed information. It was a moment that sent a ripple of restrained hope through Glynn. Years of confinement had taught him patience, resilience, and the quiet endurance needed to survive the harshest of injustices. But patience alone could not undo the years he had lost. Still, the ruling offered a glimpse of possibility, the chance to reclaim a life interrupted by forces beyond his control. The judge's decision was not immediate freedom. Instead, it called for further review, for new investigations, and for the legal system to confront its earlier mistakes. It was a step forward, yes, but one fraught with uncertainty. Every legal avenue could be challenged, every procedure could be delayed, and every opponent could resist. Glynn knew that the path to exoneration was not yet complete. Even as the ruling signaled potential, the emotional weight pressed heavily. Relief mingled with anxiety, hope collided with fear. Glynn understood that this was the beginning of a new phase in his journey, one that required not only persistence but the courage to face the uncertainty of the legal process once again. Outside the courtroom, his family waited, silent but watchful. Their faces reflected the same mix of cautious optimism and lingering dread. They had endured years of worry, despair, and helplessness. Now, they had a reason to hope, yet they understood the fight was far from over. For Glynn, the ruling was both validation and a reminder. The system that had wronged him had acknowledged its errors, but acknowledgement alone would not restore the years, the freedom, or the sense of normalcy that had been taken. He would need to continue the fight, using every ounce of strength, every scrap of evidence, and every ally willing to stand beside him. And as Glynn left the courtroom that day, a quiet determination settled over him. Because even with a ruling in his favor, he knew that powerful forces were determined to keep him imprisoned, and the next battle for his life and his freedom was about to begin. Even after the judge's partial ruling, Glynn Simmons knew the hardest work was still ahead. The acknowledgement of errors and the promise of further review offered hope, but hope alone could not undo the years he had spent behind bars. He understood, with clarity and resolve, that the fight for exoneration required persistence, strategy, and unwavering attention to detail. Glynn returned to his cell with a renewed sense of purpose. Each day became a careful calculation, gathering information, reviewing legal documents, and collaborating with his attorneys and supporters outside. The legal system had opened a door, but walking through it demanded vigilance. Every motion filed, every witness interviewed, and every piece of overlooked evidence could tip the scales toward freedom. He thought constantly about the time he had lost. The birthdays missed, the family milestones gone, the simple routines of ordinary life denied. These thoughts fueled him, transforming frustration into determination. Glynn refused to allow despair to take root. His energy was directed entirely toward reclaiming the life that had been stolen. The response from the prosecution and law enforcement was immediate. Resistance emerged in subtle ways: delays, challenges, procedural roadblocks. Each attempt to slow the process tested Glynn's patience and resolve. He had learned to endure the prison system, but now he was forced to endure the resistance of a system reluctant to admit its mistakes. Even in these moments, Glynn found allies. Innocence advocates, legal experts, and a network of supporters rallied around him. Their belief in his case offered both practical assistance and emotional sustenance. Letters of encouragement, visits, and coordinated legal strategies reminded him that he was not alone, that the fight for justice could extend beyond the walls that confined him. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Glynn meticulously compiled evidence, reviewed transcripts, and documented every inconsistency in the original investigation. The process was exhausting, yet every effort brought him closer to a moment that had once seemed impossible. Freedom earned not by luck, but by relentless pursuit of the truth. And yet, the tension never fully dissipated. Every day carried the knowledge that the system he relied upon could falter again, that obstacles could appear without warning, and that opponents would not relinquish their assumptions lightly. Glynn balanced hope with vigilance, understanding that the journey toward exoneration demanded both. And as he prepared for the next legal hearing, armed with the evidence that could finally prove his innocence, Glynn could not know what awaited him. Whether the truth would triumph at last, or whether years of resistance, skepticism, and entrenched power would conspire to keep him imprisoned indefinitely. For years, Glynn Simmons had endured the weight of a wrongful conviction, each day behind bars a reminder of a life stolen. But now, a breakthrough was beginning to take shape, a subtle shift in the case that had the power to change everything. It started with the smallest details, overlooked evidence, inconsistencies in testimonies, and witnesses who had finally come forward with information that had been ignored. The legal team worked tirelessly, sifting through documents, reviewing case files, and connecting dots that had long been dismissed. Each discovery offered a glimmer of possibility, a chance to challenge the conviction that had defined Glynn's life. For him, these moments were both exhilarating and terrifying, hope tempered by the knowledge that progress could be fragile. Glynn had spent countless nights imagining this possibility, but reality was always more complicated than imagination. He understood that the acknowledgement of new evidence was only the first step. The court could reject it, the prosecution could resist it, and procedural hurdles could delay justice indefinitely. Yet, for the first time, he felt that momentum was on his side. He reflected on the years lost, the birthdays, holidays, and milestones that had passed without him. Those memories fueled his determination, but they also sharpened his focus. Every detail, every document, every witness statement had to be precise. Any mistake could set the case back months or even years. Glynn's mind became a map of timelines, contradictions, and opportunities, a strategy forged from necessity and survival. The breakthrough came when a witness, previously hesitant to speak, revealed crucial information that contradicted key points in the original trial. This testimony not only cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative, but also aligned perfectly with inconsistencies Glynn and his legal team had uncovered. It was a turning point, a crack in the wall that had kept the truth buried for so long. With this new evidence, motions were filed and hearings were scheduled. Glynn watched as the wheels of justice, slow, deliberate, and often obstructed, began to turn in his favor. Each day brought new challenges, yet also renewed hope. For the first time in years, he imagined a future where the injustice might finally be corrected. Despite the promise of progress, the tension was unrelenting. The system that had imprisoned him was not easily swayed, and resistance from those invested in the original conviction remained formidable. Glynn understood that even with the breakthrough, the battle was far from over. Every victory would be tested, every claim scrutinized, and every opportunity could be challenged. And as Glynn prepared to present this critical evidence at the upcoming hearing, he could not know that forces determined to uphold his conviction were already mobilizing to undermine the truth, threatening to prolong the nightmare that had defined his life for so long. The day of the hearing arrived with a weight that seemed to fill the entire courthouse. Glynn Simmons felt the tension pressing down on him, a mix of anticipation, anxiety, and cautious hope. Years of wrongful imprisonment had brought him to this exact moment, the opportunity to present the evidence that could finally challenge the conviction that had defined his life. Glynn had prepared meticulously. Every statement, every piece of evidence, every witness account had been reviewed, cross-checked, and organized. The culmination of years of research and determination rested on these proceedings. He knew that the hearing could not undo the past, but it could open the door to a future where justice might finally be recognized. The courtroom was solemn, the air thick with the gravity of what was at stake. The prosecution remained steadfast, a reminder that even with compelling evidence, the fight for truth would not be easy. Resistance was expected, as those invested in the original conviction sought to maintain control over the narrative. Glynn's attorney began presenting the newly uncovered evidence. Witnesses who had once been silent spoke with clarity, providing accounts that directly contradicted critical elements of the original trial. Each statement chipped away at the prosecution's case, revealing gaps and inconsistencies that had been overlooked or dismissed years ago. As the evidence was laid bare, Glynn felt a mixture of relief and tension. Relief that the truth was finally being heard. Tension because he knew the process could still turn against him. The system had failed him before, and he could not assume it would act differently now. Every word, every motion, every objection from the prosecution could alter the outcome. The judge listened intently, weighing each argument, each document, and each witness testimony. The atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty. Glynn's family, watching from the gallery, held their collective breath, feeling the emotional weight of every moment. Years of hope, fear, and despair seemed to converge in this one pivotal proceeding. Glynn's mind raced, thinking of all the years lost, the life he had been denied, and the possibility that, finally, justice might prevail. He understood that the hearing was not a guarantee, but a critical step, a chance to rewrite a story that had been dominated by error and assumption. And as the judge prepared to deliver a decision, Glynn held his breath, acutely aware that the words about to be spoken could either unlock his freedom or reinforce the walls that had confined him for far too long. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the judge prepared to speak. Glynn Simmons sat rigid, the culmination of years of injustice, preparation, and unwavering determination pressing on him in that moment. Every second seemed stretched, every heartbeat amplified by the weight of what was at stake. This was the moment where hope and fear collided. The judge began by acknowledging the irregularities in Glynn's original trial. Overlooked evidence, inconsistent witness statements, and procedural errors that had never been properly addressed. For the first time, the court formally recognized the possibility that a grave mistake had been made, that the man sitting before them might, in fact, be innocent. Relief washed over Glynn, but it was tempered by caution. Legal acknowledgement was not synonymous with freedom. There were still battles to fight, motions to file, and arguments to make. Yet, the ruling represented a crucial turning point. It offered a pathway, however narrow, toward reclaiming the life that had been stolen. Glynn's family exhaled collectively, the tension in their bodies slightly easing. After years of helplessness, they could finally see tangible evidence that justice might prevail. They had endured countless nights of worry, anguish, and fear, and now the first real signs of vindication were emerging. Even as the judge laid out the next steps, further investigation, additional hearings, and the potential for a new trial, Glynn understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had forced the system to confront its own failures. He had, through persistence and courage, begun to tilt the scales of justice back toward balance. Yet the journey was far from complete. The acknowledgement of errors invited scrutiny, resistance, and delays. Those who had fought to uphold the original conviction were unlikely to relent easily. Every motion could be challenged, Every piece of evidence could be contested, and every new hearing could introduce fresh uncertainty. Glynn knew that vigilance was not optional, it was survival. Still, for the first time in over a decade, Glynn allowed himself a quiet sense of hope. The system had begun to recognize the truth. Years of preparation, patience, and unyielding resolve were beginning to yield results. Freedom, once a distant dream, was slowly moving within reach. And as Glynn returned to his cell that evening, the weight of anticipation heavy on his shoulders, he could not know that the next chapter of his fight would demand every ounce of courage he had left and test whether the justice he had so carefully pursued would truly set him free. For Glynn Simmons, every day behind bars had been a lesson in endurance, patience, and quiet determination. But now, after years of painstaking effort, legal battles, and unwavering perseverance, the contours of freedom were beginning to take shape. The acknowledgement of errors in his original conviction had opened doors, and he was steadily moving toward the possibility of exoneration. Yet the closer he came to that goal, the more acute the pressure became. The legal process was relentless. New hearings were scheduled, motions filed, and evidence revisited with meticulous care. Glynn knew that even minor missteps could derail the progress he had fought so hard to achieve. Every witness account had to withstand scrutiny, every document had to be flawless, and every argument had to be strategically sound. There was no room for error. The stakes were absolute. Even as hope grew, resistance remained constant. The prosecution and law enforcement, invested in upholding the original conviction, scrutinized every new claim, every piece of evidence, every motion. They pressed against the progress Glynn had made, forcing him and his legal team to anticipate every possible objection and counter every challenge before it could derail the case. Through it all, Glynn's resolve hardened. He had spent too many years confined, watched too many opportunities slip away, and endured too much injustice to allow the system's resistance to break him. Each delay, each procedural obstacle, only reinforced his determination to see the fight through to the end. Support from outside advocates had become invaluable. Letters, research, and tireless coordination with legal experts created a network that strengthened Glynn's position. He realized that while he had spent years confined, the world beyond the prison walls could act as an ally, a force capable of amplifying truth and pressing the system toward justice. As the next hearing approached, Glynn prepared with care. He reviewed every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every motion filed. He thought about the years lost, the milestones missed, and the simple moments of life denied. Those memories fueled him, sharpening his focus and resolve. Freedom was not just a legal outcome, it was the reclamation of a life stolen. And as Glynn stepped into the courtroom once more, knowing that this hearing could finally bring him closer to the life he had been denied, he had no way of knowing that unseen obstacles, determined opposition, and the fragility of the legal system would soon test his courage in ways he could never have anticipated. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation. Glynn Simmons, after years of living under the shadow of a wrongful conviction, was again at the center of a legal battle that could finally determine the course of his life. The evidence that had once been ignored or dismissed was now ready to be presented, and for the first time, the possibility of exoneration felt within reach. Every detail mattered. Glynn had spent countless hours with his attorneys reviewing witness statements, re-examining evidence, and preparing arguments that would withstand even the harshest scrutiny. The system that had confined him for so long had no room for error, and neither could he. Each statement, each motion, each reference to overlooked evidence carried the weight of a decade spent behind bars. The hearing began, and Glynn listened as his attorney methodically presented the case. Witnesses who had remained silent for years stepped forward, their accounts challenging the foundation of the original conviction. Their words painted a picture entirely at odds with the prosecution's narrative, revealing errors, inconsistencies, and assumptions that had gone unchecked. The prosecution pushed back with intensity. Every claim was questioned, every motion contested, every piece of evidence scrutinized. They were determined to maintain the conviction, to preserve the narrative that had dominated Glynn's life for so long. Yet with each counterargument, the truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. Glynn sat quietly, absorbing every word, every testimony, every motion. The tension was suffocating. Years of frustration, despair, and injustice converged in this single courtroom, and he understood that the outcome of this hearing could very well determine whether he would finally walk free or remain trapped within a system that had failed him. As the hearing progressed, small victories began to emerge. A witness recanted a previous statement, inconsistencies were exposed, and procedural errors were formally acknowledged. Each of these moments, though subtle, carried enormous significance. They chipped away at the walls that had confined him for over a decade, opening cracks through which justice might finally reach him. Yet Glynn also knew that these victories were fragile. Legal systems are slow to admit fault, and the opposition was relentless. Every piece of evidence could be challenged, every testimony questioned, every decision delayed. The battle was far from over, and the tension in the room reflected the delicate balance between hope and uncertainty. And as the judge prepared to make a ruling on the new evidence, Glynn felt the weight of every lost year pressing upon him, knowing that the words spoken next could either finally restore his freedom or extend the nightmare he had endured for far too long. The courtroom was silent, the weight of anticipation pressing down on Glynn Simmons. Years of wrongful imprisonment, countless hearings, and endless legal battles had led to this singular moment. Every heartbeat felt amplified, every breath a reminder of how precarious his future had become. This was the moment where truth would confront the machinery of justice, and the outcome could finally determine the course of his life. The judge spoke slowly, deliberately, acknowledging the new evidence, the recanted testimonies, and the procedural errors that had marred Glynn's original trial. For the first time, the court formally recognized the possibility that he had been wrongfully convicted. It was a statement that carried immense weight, both legally and emotionally. Glynn felt a mix of relief and lingering tension. Legal acknowledgement was one thing, freedom was another. The ruling opened the door, but he understood the journey to exoneration was still fraught with obstacles. There were further hearings, motions, and bureaucratic steps to navigate. Yet, for the first time in over a decade, the possibility of walking out of prison a free man seemed real. He thought of the years lost, the milestones missed, the simple joys of ordinary life that had been denied to him. That reflection fueled a determination deeper than ever before. Glynn knew that he could not allow the process to falter now. Every decision, every step forward, needed to be precise and unwavering. The opposition from the prosecution remained a constant reminder of the resistance he would face. They scrutinized every detail, challenged every motion, and attempted to maintain control of the narrative that had kept him imprisoned. Yet, the mounting evidence, coupled with the courage and persistence of his legal team, steadily eroded the foundation of the case that had wronged him. As the judge continued, Glynn felt a cautious optimism rise within him. The acknowledgement of error was more than symbolic. It was a tangible shift toward justice. Each word spoken by the court was a reminder that persistence, patience, and unyielding determination could eventually overcome even the most entrenched injustices. Still, Glynn's mind raced with uncertainty. Freedom was close, but the final hurdles could appear at any moment. Every legal motion could be delayed, every new argument contested, and every procedural detail scrutinized to prevent the ultimate outcome. The road ahead, while illuminated by hope, was still treacherous. And as the judge paused, allowing the weight of the decision to settle over the room, Glynn held his breath, realizing that in the next few words, His life could either finally be reclaimed or remain trapped in the shadow of injustice for years to come. After more than a decade of injustice, Glynn Simmons finally stepped into a moment that had once seemed unimaginable. Years of wrongful imprisonment, endless hearings, and the relentless struggle against a system that had failed him all led to this day. The day when the truth could no longer be ignored. The court formally acknowledged the errors of the past, including the mishandling of evidence, unreliable witness testimony, and procedural mistakes that had condemned Glynn to a life he had not earned. The recognition was both legal and moral, a rare victory in a system where mistakes so often go uncorrected. As the verdict was read, Glynn felt a tidal wave of emotion, relief, disbelief, and a deep, overwhelming gratitude. The nightmare that had defined so many years was finally ending. Freedom was no longer a distant dream. It was a tangible, achievable reality. Outside the courtroom, family and supporters embraced him, tears flowing freely. For them, the fight had been long and exhausting, but the reward was profound. A man unjustly imprisoned for years was finally coming home. Every hug, every word of comfort, carried the weight of countless moments lost, milestones missed, and a life interrupted. Glynn reflected on the years behind bars, the nights of solitude, the quiet desperation, and the steadfast belief in his innocence. Those years had shaped him, hardened him, and tested him in ways most could not imagine. Yet, through it all, he had never relinquished hope. He had endured what many would have deemed unbearable, and in doing so, he had preserved the truth against immense odds. Freedom, however, was not just a personal triumph. It was a testament to the importance of persistence, advocacy, and the unwavering belief that justice, though often delayed, could ultimately prevail. Glynn's exoneration would serve as a reminder that the system, flawed though it may be, could be corrected when courage and truth aligned. And while the scars of wrongful imprisonment would remain, emotional, psychological, and physical, Glynn now had the opportunity to reclaim his life, rebuild relationships, and pursue the future that had been stolen. The fight had been long, arduous, and at times nearly hopeless, but justice had finally been restored. In that moment, Glynn Simmons stepped into the world a free man, no longer defined by the crime he did not commit, but by the resilience, determination, and unwavering pursuit of truth that had carried him through the darkest years of his life. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. And in that triumph, Glynn's story became more than a tale of wrongful conviction. It became a testament to hope, perseverance, and the unyielding power of truth. Glynn Simmons' story is a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is rarely easy, but always necessary. Wrongful convictions leave lives shattered, families broken, and communities questioning the very system meant to protect them. Yet, as Glynn's journey shows, perseverance, advocacy, and unwavering belief in the truth can ultimately restore what was lost. If you were moved by Glynn's story, consider joining the conversation. Share this video to raise awareness about wrongful convictions, support organizations dedicated to exonerating the innocent, and help ensure that justice reaches those who have been denied it. Don't forget to subscribe to Innocence Uncovered for more real stories of resilience, truth, and the fight against injustice. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Together, we can shine a light on the truth and honor the lives affected by wrongful convictions.